King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King's bizarre desire for attention. King Louis XIV of France, known as the Sun King, reigned for over 70 years and built one of the most powerful and glamorous courts in Europe. Despite his fame for creating the magnificent Palace of Versailles and his numerous political victories, Louis XIV had a rather peculiar sexual appetite. His sexual desires were often centered around the concept of attention and power. Louis was notorious for his numerous affairs, but his sexual fantasies were far more elaborate and unusual. One of the most bizarre aspects of his sexual life was his obsession with the idea of being watched. He had a penchant for performing sexual acts in public, surrounded by his courtiers, who were required to witness and sometimes even participate in these events. This exhibitionism was tied to his belief that his actions were divine and that his every move, even in the bedroom, should be a spectacle for his subjects to witness. His most infamous sexual fantasy involved the idea of humbling those around him by displaying his dominance in front of his courtiers. He would often hold grand banquets where sexual acts were performed openly, with Louis at the center of attention. This constant need for admiration and control over others led him to engage in public sexual displays that were not only shocking, but also highly controversial for the time. One of Louis XIV's most notorious sexual acts occurred in his later years, where he would indulge in orgies in front of his court. His sexual partners included numerous women from the aristocracy, and it is said that Louis used these sexual gatherings as a way to assert his absolute power. By putting his courtiers in the position of watching his sexual exploits, he reinforced his belief in his divine right to rule and his sense of superiority over everyone else in his court. The Sun King's sexual fantasies were not just a matter of indulgence. They were a way for him to reinforce his power and control over those around him. His fantasies blurred the line between the personal and the political, and his sexual life became an extension of his absolute monarchy. Why did Louis XIV, a king known for his political brilliance, use sexual exhibitionism as a way to assert his dominance? Was it purely about power, or was there something deeper at play in his sexual fantasies? What do you think? Was Louis XIV's need for attention a product of his absolute power, or was it a psychological desire for validation? Share your thoughts in the comments. King Caligula of Rome, the emperor's extreme fetishes and abuse of power. Perhaps one of the most infamous and disturbing figures in history is the Roman Emperor Caligula. Known for his cruelty, excess, and erratic behavior, Caligula's sexual fantasies were both shocking and extreme. His reign, though short, was marked by an uncontrollable desire for power and the satisfaction of his every whim, including his sexual ones. One of Caligula's most notorious sexual fantasies involved the idea of complete domination. He is said to have engaged in sexual acts with both women and men, but his true desires lay in pushing the boundaries of consent and human decency. Caligula was rumored to have turned his palace into a den of debauchery, where he engaged in acts of sexual violence and coercion. His sexual fantasies were fueled by his absolute power as emperor, and he would often force his subjects into sexual acts with him, regardless of their consent. In one of the most shocking incidents, Caligula reportedly ordered that his favorite sister, Julia Livilla, be married to him and used his political power to fulfill his incestuous desires. This fantasy of incest, which was not only illegal but also taboo in Roman society, revealed just how far Caligula was willing to go to satisfy his fantasies. He would also hold banquets where sexual acts were performed in front of the guests, forcing them to participate or watch. But it wasn't just the sexual acts that were disturbing. It was the way Caligula treated his subjects. He would often make them perform degrading acts, humiliate them publicly, and use them as mere tools for his sexual gratification. His reign was a period of extreme cruelty and excess, and his sexual fantasies were just one of the ways in which he demonstrated his complete disregard for morality and the well-being of others. Was Caligula's extreme sexual behavior a result of his absolute power and paranoia, or was it a manifestation of his psychological instability? What do you think? Did Caligula's sexual fantasies reflect the corrupting nature of unchecked power, or was it the manifestation of deeper psychological issues? Share your thoughts in the comments. King Henry VIII of England, the king's obsession with sexual control. King Henry VIII of England is perhaps best known for his 6 marriages and his role in the English Reformation. However, behind his marriages and political moves lay a man obsessed with control, especially in his sexual life. His sexual fantasies were intertwined with his desire for power, and he used his marriages not just for procreation but to satisfy his personal desires. Henry VIII's sexual fantasies were largely centered around domination and manipulation. His relationships with his wives were far from romantic and were instead strategic. His desire to control the women in his life went beyond mere power dynamics. He was obsessed with possessing them physically and emotionally. Henry's most infamous act was his manipulation of Anne Boleyn, whom he courted with intense passion, only to later turn against her when she failed to provide him with a male heir. But it wasn't just Anne Boleyn who was the object of his sexual desires. Henry VIII's need for control was evident in his obsession with having male heirs, which led to the execution of two of his wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, both of whom he accused of infidelity and treason. His constant need to dominate and control his wives and mistresses made his relationships toxic and unhealthy, and it ultimately led to the death and downfall of several women in his life. Henry's sexual fantasies also included bizarre rituals. He often engaged in hunting as a way to assert his physical dominance, but he also liked to view his mistresses and wives as trophies, believing that their ability to bear him a male heir was a reflection of his virility. He would often publicly display his power by parading his wives and mistresses in front of his court, reinforcing his belief in his own sexual prowess and control. Why did Henry VIII, despite his power, remain obsessed with control over his wives and mistresses? Was his desire for male heirs a reflection of his legacy, or was it about something deeper? What do you think? Was Henry VIII's obsession with control rooted in his fear of legacy and power, or was it a reflection of his insecurities? Share your thoughts in the comments. King Frederick the Great of Prussia, the king's obsession with chastity and repression. Frederick II of Prussia, known as Frederick the Great, is often remembered as one of the most enlightened monarchs in European history. A patron of the arts and an innovative military strategist, Frederick's reign was largely defined by intellectual pursuits. However, his sexual life tells a different, more complicated story. Despite his status as a king, Frederick the Great never married and remained celibate throughout his life, a choice that was likely deeply tied to his sexual fantasies and personal desires. Frederick's sexual fantasies were focused on chastity and sexual repression. He rejected marriage and avoided physical intimacy, possibly due to his own complex feelings about sexuality. Historians speculate that Frederick may have harbored latent homosexual desires, but due to the strict social and cultural expectations of his time, he suppressed these feelings in favor of maintaining his public image as a monarch. His rejection of traditional sexual relationships and marriage also reflects his desire for power and independence. By remaining celibate, Frederick was able to avoid the obligations that came with marriage, including producing heirs or ceding authority to a wife. This abstinence was not due to religious reasons but rather a deep-seated need for control over his own life and a rejection of the traditional roles expected of a king. His celibacy was, in a sense, a form of rebellion against the expectations of kingship and an attempt to assert his dominance over his own sexual identity. While Frederick the Great's celibacy and avoidance of marriage may seem like a noble or enlightened choice, they also point to a deeper repression that may have affected his relationships and his ability to form close emotional bonds. Was Frederick the Great's celibacy a personal choice of independence and control, or was it a result of deeper, unaddressed desires and societal pressures? What do you think? Did Frederick's rejection of marriage and sexuality represent a rebellion against royal expectations, or was it a sign of hidden repression? Share your thoughts in the comments. The strange sexual fantasies of these royal men reveal a dark side to the glamorous and powerful lives they led. Behind the crowns, robes, and thrones were men with deeply rooted desires that shaped their decisions and often had profound impacts on their reigns. These sexual fantasies were sometimes a result of their immense power, while other times they were a reflection of psychological complexities or societal pressures. Regardless of the reasons, these kings' intimate lives were just as controversial as their political actions, leaving a legacy of power, manipulation, and sometimes tragic consequences. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Which of these kings had the most shocking sexual fantasies in your opinion? And how do you think their personal desires influenced their reigns and their legacies? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more historical deep dives into royal lives.